Welcome everyone to Epoch Philosophy, just in podcast form. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, podcast, everything at large at Epoch Philosophy as a whole. Consider pledging a couple dollars a month to help keep this entire project alive and get access to some really cool perks like early access to videos, voting on future videos, Discord access, editing tutorials, and the like. Without further ado, let's get into it. All right, guys, we have Grafton Tanner here. He's coming out with a book, The Hours Have Lost Their Clock. We're going to be getting into that. Grafton, you're a professor at University of Georgia, yeah?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Author of a number of books around critical theory, cultural theory, stuff like that. Figured I'd have him on. This is our first podcast, and Grafton, you are our first guest. So as we were talking about earlier, congratulations, man. You made it to the big leagues. Small little 20,000 subscribed little philosophy channel, but nonetheless should be fun, man.
Yes. Hey, that's great. That's more than a lot of other ones.
Yeah, it's weird for philosophy on YouTube. You know, you can, at least if it, especially for channels, like we were talking about, like Plastic Pills, right? Or other I want to say core really philosophy channels like Acid Horizon's another podcast that does it, but pop philosophy is what I would call it, with things like ContraPoints and Philosophy Tube. I like them a lot. Like I really, really enjoy those channels, but it doesn't feel like raw like philosophy or theory. It's more sort of like cultural commentary around certain things. I don't know if you've watched them before, but yeah, it's a little hard for small actual academic-y philosophy channels to get much headway, and that's understandable, but yeah, no, it seems to be doing good. So all right, man. So, the hours have lost their clock. I read a little bit of the intro, and it's super interesting, right? The politics of nostalgia. So, how would you kind of describe from the get-go as an introduction, sort of into this text that's coming out in a bit?
Well, thanks for having me on. First off, glad to be the first guest. This was a book that came out of probably, the last half decade of research into nostalgia, which came from my fascination over the 2010s with sort of one, to use the term of an old nostalgia scholar, Fred Davis, one nostalgia wave after another that occurred over the 2010s. I remember like in 2020 during the pandemic, as I was writing the book, there was something that came out, some marketing press release or what have you, that was it said something like, nostalgia is all the rage now, or like the 80s are back, or something like that. And I got so triggered because I was thinking back to like 2010, 2011, when I heard the same conversations. I heard the same things. People were saying the 80s are back, blah, blah, blah. And to have almost the same kind of rhetoric being used, in 2011 and then again in 2020 was kind of shocking. And I think it shows me that that this sort of the emotional, I guess, like power of nostalgia has never really gone away. Definitely over the last decade, certainly before then, but the weirdest thing to me is that people still talk about it as if it's this new trendy thing, and it's not. It's been co-opted by corporations and politicians for quite a long time. So anyway, over the 2010s, I was just really noticing it everywhere, just like a lot of people, and I wanted to kind of dig into it more, and that kicked me off on years and years of researching it and writing about it. And so this book is essentially a culmination of these thoughts and writings that I've done, and it essentially asks the questions: why is there so much nostalgia today? What is nostalgia, number one? Why is there so much of it today? And is it a good thing to have so much of it today? And what I look at mainly throughout the 10 chapters and intro and conclusion is I kind of pinpoint various areas of, I guess, like the 21st century, cultural movements, social things that are happening, politics, what have you, and look at them, understand that they have something to do with nostalgia, and then ask why. So there's a chapter on in the United States, has been for a while a conversation about what do we do with all the Confederate monuments, that are monuments to these, this treasonous state that lost the Civil War, and that are, if you've ever driven through the southern United States, they're everywhere. What do we do about them? They're obviously like, harkening back to a really horrific period in history, and the supporters of them are like sort of, they suffer from this kind of lost cause nostalgia for the Civil War. There's a chapter on that. There's a section about the nostalgia industry, how nostalgia tends to get commodified to create certain, films that are supposed to catch your attention, and blockbusters that make tons of money, and music that is like blatantly nostalgic that ends up, sort of getting millions of streams on Spotify, et cetera. I look at the development of the Department of Homeland Security as a nostalgic enterprise, how climate change and nostalgia are connected. So all of these major things that we're having to deal with today, and kind of try to look under the hood and reveal that nostalgia has a lot to do with them. And is that a problem or not?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting too. Like genuinely, and I'm not obviously not just saying that as you're a guest on here. That's actually like I find and have always kind of found, as I said earlier with you, that retro or even things that pertain to the past and history, but in a little bit of a deeper emotional or like philosophical level, right? Things like nostalgia, they play a really big role in a lot of ways, right? And I read pretty much the entire intro, and there's a lot there, right? You talk about this pattern of almost exploitation of like nostalgia, right? In a political context, like the elites or people or politicians continually use this to facilitate some means. And what happens is, from my understanding, is that there's like a skepticism almost of nostalgia. Is that right? Where people are sort of like, it's like this really pathological or like negative thing. I think you said in here there was Johannes Hofer or something like that. I think his name coined nostalgia as an intense pathological longing for one's homeland, or but something pathological. So I'm curious to see what you think on that.
Yeah. So there was this medical student in the late 1680s who wrote a dissertation on a new disease. He wanted to come up with this new disease that he thought he saw breaking out among Swiss mercenaries of the time, who were dying from what people thought was like a kind of intense homesickness. And so he thought, I'm going to coin this this new disease. Maybe he thought he was going to make a name for himself. Who really knows? We can't say. But so he just wrote this dissertation, and over time, his advisors and other kind of well-known doctors of the time really liked the idea, and it sort of became a thing. It became a disease that other physicians wrote their dissertations on, and that if you were a doctor of that time in France through like the 18th and 19th centuries, you knew what nostalgia was, although you may not exactly know how to diagnose it, because it was a slippery kind of disease that seemed to have every symptom under the sun attached to it. So, but the point is that it was first and foremost in history a disease that people thought if you caught it and you weren't repatriated, that you would die from it. And the people who were the most scared of it were the military. They feared that if nostalgia broke out among the troops, and especially during like the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, then it could destroy troop morale, or it might destroy the troops themselves. And so it was this real concern, and it was like bound up with elements of like masculinity and military might. If you had ranks that all suffer from nostalgia, you were too weak. You couldn't fight the kind of war that they wanted to fight back then, a kind of a total war, a punishing war, that Napoleon waged. And then I think since then, what has happened over the years, and I dig into this a little bit in the book, is that it drifts away from being a disease to being just an emotion. And in the early 20th century, the psychiatrists took it up. They thought, well, maybe it's not like a bodily disease like you would catch, like, you know, influenza or something, but maybe it's a mental disease, you know. But then by the middle of the 20th century, some psychologists, psychiatrists are kind of writing about it, but around then it starts to really disjoin from its kind of clinical definition and become more of this normal thing that everybody can kind of feel. And I write in the book that I think that some of the skepticism that people have, I think it comes from two things. I think that clinical trace is still within nostalgia. You know, I think that it hasn't quite completely detached from its, you know, disease origins. But I think at the same time, the skepticism has a lot to do with the fact that you're right. Nostalgia is used all the time by you know, political candidates and politicians, almost to the point where every time they invoke it, you just want to roll your eyes and think, here we go again. They're talking about the good old days, you know, or like corporations will use it and what have you. And then, of course, the most recent probably political example that we all know of would be how Donald Trump used it, where suddenly it's no longer this kind of rote, you know, trope that they use, you know, just to try to get votes. Now it's this like almost this like dangerous current that people latch onto, and they go, you know what, we're going to get back to the past. I don't care what it takes. I'm going to support this guy. I'm going to build some walls. You're not allowed in my country anymore, blah, blah, blah. So I think that how it's been used is certainly contributes to the skepticism, but I think it has something to do with the fact that it has that clinical origin and it hasn't totally shaken it off.
Yeah, no. And that's really funny how, you know, we kind of, what you just did there kind of is laid out sort of like a process of how nostalgia has been used in a historical context. But what's funny is, you know, it's almost like it's like inverted itself, right? Like it was like something pathological and they wanted to get away from it as soon as possible, like old militaries. And now it's like something that we've learned to like harness, right? On a very, but you know, perhaps like political or material level, right? Corporations are now using this. Politicians are invoking it. And yeah, no, that's you know, when you think about something like nostalgia, it's something like sort of almost distant, and it's especially as like an emotion, right? Like nostalgia, right? You only get that here and there as we think, but it seems like just from the introduction that I read, it's like nostalgia is kind of rooted in everything, and there's this almost like I don't know, like there's this distance to it, but now in the 2010s, and perhaps we can harken back to like Mark Fisher, right? Where Mark Fisher talked about his idea of hauntology. It feels like now in the 2010s we are really having to contend with the idea of nostalgia and how it plays a role in all these different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the chickens have kind of come home to roost a little bit because it needed to be well, this should have been dealt with already. Not just nostalgia in politics, but emotion in politics. There's a paper by two rhetorical scholars from the early 2000s, Harriman and Lucades, about emotion in politics, in particular, in like a visual rhetoric, and how images can produce certain kinds of emotional responses that are really valid, but that can go different ways because emotions can be used in different ways. And at the end of their paper, they write that, you know, it'd be really easy for someone to come along and manipulate populations and manipulate their emotions. And we could get to a point where people are so, emotionally manipulated that will be a discourse that will show up along with it that says somebody needs to tamp these emotions back down. We got to get some control here because people are too angry, or people are too nostalgic, or people are. It's like the horse has been let out of the barn or something. We got to get it back in. And what might end up happening is you'll have people who will endorse a strongman kind of candidate who will be the one to promise to do that. And this was like, they wrote this in like 2000. Okay, well, flash forward 15 years, And Donald Trump did exactly that. On the one hand, he whips up people in this emotional, kind of like fervor, but then also is like, we're going to do something about it. One of the emotions that he kicks up is nostalgia, saturating that and kind of sort of, or I should say, inducing that in populations, trying to get people to really yearn for a supposed golden age that we've long gotten away from. At the same time, he says, but I'm going to be the one to get you back there. So trust me, and we'll get some kind of control here. And that is something that I think we're now having to deal with in a way that I don't think we have had to before.
Right. So, this takes you're taking a little bit of a different approach, right? Where a lot of sort of cultural theory on nostalgia is one of like this Fisher-esque hauntology where we can't recognize the future, and perhaps it's still here, but like your main thesis, as I understand it now, really is that like, look, this is like this affect, this emotion that is being deeply harnessed and used in a very almost pathological, as we were speaking earlier, and harmful nature, and it's doing a lot of different things that we don't understand. And as you pointed out, like that paper in early 2000s kind of really predicted that. So yeah, there seems to be almost like a libidinal buildup of nostalgia.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're having to deal with it in a different way now, also because of how it's become a way for advertisers to sell products. We've had just enough amount of research and like consumer sciences and branding and marketing to know that nostalgia gets associated with certain buying habits, including the nostalgia is associated with giving up one's money. And so, of course, corporations love that. And so they think, well, if I can try to induce nostalgia for a brand like Coca-Cola or Shell Oil or something, then the likelihood is that people are going to make purchases. And of course, they like that. Okay, well, over 100 years ago, that wasn't the conversation about nostalgia. Nostalgia was used in the early 20th century in criminological discourses. So back then, the idea was that the criminal might be nostalgic and they needed to be cured of it in order to be a contributing member of society. Now it's flipped. Corporations don't want to beat the nostalgia out of you. They want to keep you at a low level of it so that you'll keep buying.
Ooh, yeah. No, that's interesting. It's almost like a little bit of a Foucault sort of power structure there with nostalgia, and it like and like it's hard not to see that, right? Whenever you point it out, it's this very deep drive that it's got its grips in everything. One of the more interesting things that I think relates a little bit to nostalgia that I see as well is that and it's just all of this. It puts me back to reading Ghosts of My Life from Mark Fisher, and there was a section, and of course Mark Fisher's an articulator, right? Like this isn't necessarily something Mark Fisher said per se, but it's something he pulled from a thinker that he thought was very, very prescient. And I can't remember the thinker's name, and I apologize to anyone listening. But one of the most interesting things that I've heard, and I don't know if you've read about this as well, that like retro, like what these comfortable things of the past, right? These products, these franchises like Star Wars. There's this nostalgic thing of Star Wars. This retroism is coming back, right? Like for example, like cassettes are coming back. I'm actually a big cassette guy too, but I love retro stuff. But what it is it's like almost masturbatory, right? And that's like super strange. You're like, what do you mean by that? Like when we think masturbatory, it means you're like there's like some conceited like self like love or something, but it's actually not. It's like really what retro is you're getting, it's like masturbation or Viagra, where like when you have sex with intercourse with an individual, in a way, what happens there in a very modern or contemporary context is that like it's not really like intercourse. You're just like kind of getting a quick fix. You're letting out all your libidinal sort of drives that kind of capitalism instills in you, right? This constant pressure, and that's what sex is today. And retro today is a comfort thing. It's like a masturbatory comfort. It's this quick little fix of comfort of the past that you get in a contemporary context in a world that is in many ways objectively like kind of worse off than the past.
Yeah, and I do see retro functioning a lot like that. I mean, I think that from the corporation's perspective, retro is just a way for them to make money.
Right.
Is or franchise building is a way, which the franchises that get built in terms of cinema, we're talking about movies that are meant to elicit a nostalgic response, like Star Wars or like, I mean, aren't they rebooting the Matrix? It's like
Yeah.
anything from the past up for grabs. And the point of that is to make money. And the result, um, in terms of like the social sphere, or the way that we think, even as an individual, um, is a little bit of a kind of infantilizing to a degree. And this is what, when I speak to people about nostalgia, this is a lot of what they see every day, and that's to be expected because it doesn't take much to live in this world, in the Western world, and then see Star Wars everywhere, or see Disney nostalgia everywhere. So it's kind of like it gives nostalgia a bad rap a little bit, because this is a real emotion that we can't really engineer out of our bodies. Like, we have to learn to live with them, or live with it like we have to live with anger or something. Nobody wants, or happiness that comes and goes. But it just like how social media tends to exploit anger, or even like infotainment, like something on Fox News or MSNBC exploits anger. We've got a lot of other, forces that exploit nostalgia, and that isn't always a good thing all the time.
I like that what you just said with that, like anger, like emotions, we have to learn to live with nostalgia. And we don't think about that. We don't think about it like that, right? We don't have like a responsibility to nostalgia that we would with like anger or anything like that. That's a really
Totally.
interesting concept. And that's also, I think that's kind of I never truly thought about it like that, but that's really interesting. Like, having, like, I wonder what the sociological impact of that would be, right? Where if we have a society wide, like, hey, like, uh like, tune it, keep your nostalgia at bay, or like, let's talk about this, like, as you would
Mhm.
like anger or sadness or anything like that.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
that's really interesting, and I think that's I think ultimately is that, like, there is a very right, like, there's a very interconnected political nature to nostalgia. And I actually, like, even in the introduction, as I said it earlier, you seem to like really, like, there is a lot here, so I'm definitely interested to read the book. But going
Mhm.
back to like the selling point of nostalgia, when you brought up the Matrix, it made me think, like, I've noticed something in movies and in cinema where there's like universes now. And this is like becoming like so common. Like, everyone, like, oh, the the X universe, right? So for example, there's like the Marvel universe, the DC universe. Now I'm seeing like the Conjuring universe, right? So now there's been like
Mhm.
3 Conjurings, and they're like Conjurings, like the Conjuring like film franchise is actually based off of like, I don't know if they're real, but like Ed and Lorraine Warren, and their happenings with like possession and demonic possession and all that stuff. Whether that actually exists, I'm not convinced. But nonetheless, there's
Mhm.
like a universe now, and it's like, now the point of The Conjuring isn't necessarily to make a super scary movie. As their 3rd movie came out, I noticed it wasn't scary at all. It's just that they
Mhm.
have you gripped into this universe of the Conjuring. Ed and Lorraine Warren as these characters in this movie are like just people that you root for, like like you would root for like a superhero in Marvel, because it's tied to that lore and that universe. And I definitely see that in a cinematic context.
Yes, um, it's funny that you mentioned The Conjuring not being scary, because I think about like talking with people who are always watching the latest Star Wars and latest Marvel films. And I don't know if you've ever had conversations with some of these people, but if someone asks, or like I'll ask, like, oh well, did you like the new Star Wars film? And it's like their answer is always, well, no, not really. I mean, not as much as they liked maybe the first ones, or like, what'd you think of WandaVision? Well, this I had this problem with it, I had this problem with it. And I have done this enough times with people that I remember thinking like, who do you guys actually enjoy watching these things? You know, like, but it's not about that. It's not
Right.
necessarily about having getting that whatever that emotional response to a horror film, being scared and kind of anxious and what have you, and feeling a little bit of dread, or like watching Star Wars and getting a positive emotional response to a film like that. It's something that's discussed. It's something the franchises are analyzed. They're not necessarily enjoyed. Sometimes you hear, I can't remember if Martin Scorsese said this or somebody, some old, crotchety person talking about these films. And they said like, they're like theme parks, but they're not even really like theme parks.
That was Scorsese. Yeah.
Was that him? Yeah. Because they're not really like rides. Like you might enjoy a ride, I don't hear anybody enjoying things, not enough for it to be something that, I don't know, that would make sense that they, what am I trying to say? I don't hear them talked about like someone would talk about going to a theme park, I guess. It's more something that's like that, like you're invited to participate in, to critique and analyze, or like you say, root for. And in that way they function a little more like games, or if you want to use the language of like the universes, they are kind of like miniature worlds that we're sort of invited to like live in, almost like proto virtual reality that we kind of just like, I mean, there's so much of a Star Wars universe. It is really almost like a universe. And just like real life, it's not that great, It gets to a point where it's kind of like, sometimes it's boring and sometimes it's got flashes of brilliance. But everybody tends to have an opinion of it and it isn't always positive.
Yeah, that makes me think. I've always thought about that, right? Like I actually remember when Martin Scorsese was saying that about Marvel movies. And like if you enjoy Marvel movies, I envy you. I think that is honestly sick. I can't stand them. I think they are dull, they are monotonous, they feel so uninspired. Yeah, but people love them. And that's okay, right? Like I'm more than happy that people enjoy them. I try to watch a Marvel movie and I can't stand it. I watched like a quarter of the first Avengers and like, I literally cannot watch this. And it's really funny is what's funny about that is in my mind, these movies, these sort of art pieces, it almost seems like the point of that is to escape. Now, people have always said that about art, and I've actually kind of always pushed back against that. I actually don't necessarily like that. I think the best art isn't actually anything that like makes you escape. It's something that immerses you in your own world in a different context, if that makes sense. So what's really funny about that, I actually find people like Scorsese and his points pretty valid about like a theme park. His movies follow an older style of like cinema where there's like this dramatic backdrop to things, and that's like more old fashioned than Marvel movies. Like Marvel movies are a very postmodern thing that's new. And but I think almost the point is an escape there, while with other dramatic film or like I don't even know, there's probably not even a category to say that, non-Marvel movies or non-universe movies, it seems like the point is to almost invoke some form of introspection there. And I've always kind of pushed back on that a little bit. I know, I think the same thing with video games. There's always this idea that, at least, I'm 23 and, of course I played video games all my life. I still do. And, that was always the thing with, say my parents would be like, oh, well, it's a good hobby for you to escape. And like depending on the game, man, like there's a lot of very well-written games. It's like, I always was like, I don't know if that's the point. Like when I played a game, like, I don't know if you've ever played like The Last of Us or The Witcher 3, the story and writing's actually quite incredible. Very, very good. But it almost seems like it does the opposite. It pulls you into the very mechanisms in which your life sort of, which life in general kind of revolves around. But there definitely seems to be a newer, nostalgic, postmodern sort of prescription to newer cinema today. And it fucking sells, man.
It does sell. And yeah, and I write about this some in the book, but one of the reasons why we have these films in existence today is, and being created, and why, there's so many of them today, It's got a lot to do with media consolidation and how so many of these companies, these giant multinational companies, Disney, et cetera, how they could just pretty much buy each other up indiscriminately. And when they do that and merge all their holdings, then it's easy for a film like Ralph Breaks the Internet to exist, which is a film in which you've got the Disney princesses hanging out with C-3PO, and people get to see it and they love it, and they're like, wow, all my favorite characters are in one film. And really all that is just a major media company, flexing its holdings. And when Jeff Bezos just acquired MGM, same thing. He's like, in his statement, he said, we're going to reimagine a bunch of old favorites like Thelma and Louise. And I tweeted this the other day, we're going to have the Mrs. Doubtfire cinematic universe soon. I mean, but it's a direct practice of these major corporations being able to pretty much just buy each other up.
Dude, I didn't know that Jeff Bezos bought MGM. That is like the most depressing thing. What the fuck?
He did.
Oh my God. No, but it makes perfect sense. That's everything. Like, new happenings are all just pure nostalgia. Like truly, and again, to harken back to, video games as well, that's a huge thing today. Like like to people who are listening, I'm not sure if you play games, but like some of the best selling games today are like Resident Evil 2 remake, right? Resident Evil 2, the first one came out in like 2000 or like 1999. And the game's actually really good, but like that's what's happening now. It's like this, everything is built on top of nostalgia, and it seems a little bit more prescient today. And personally, I like the idea that really it's just kind of late stage capitalism doing its thing, right? It's where production has to continually, like productivity has to continue to grow. There has to be a permanent level of growth. An actual raw creation that is really creative, dude, it's just not as profitable. It just isn't. And why the fuck would they? Why would they ever, why would they ever go back to an age or a potential time? I don't think everything's created in a bubble, right? There's inspiration for everything. But go back to a time where there was actual like someone's really doing something different, whether that's a movie, whether that's a video game. And those things exist, but they're really like they're bottom feeders compared to things like like huge studios today in cinema or large development companies in video games. It's like these are very much underground endeavors. Creation today doesn't seem to be at the forefront of anything. It's the opposite. It's like almost nostalgic regression that is the mainstream now.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the main issue, I think, with cultural creation in the 2010s. Now we're moving into the 2020s, but we may even say like most of the 21st century at this point, is that the alternatives for major big budget content that is not drenched in this kind of profit driven nostalgia, is the options are kind of getting a little limited. There aren't many alternatives. I mean, when Rob Zombie announced that he was going to reboot the Munsters, as maybe a movie, I don't know. I got to thinking about it. The Munsters was rebooted every decade since it went on the air in the 1960s. There was, I believe, there was a movie made in the 1970s. It was rebooted in the 1980s. In fact, the reboot in the 80s had more episodes and more seasons, I believe, than the series in the 1960s. It tried to get rebooted in 2012, and it didn't quite work. There was also a 90s movie. Anyway, so this is something that just has been happening. It's definitely not anything new, but the difference is that while those Munsters reboots were being greenlit, there were other films also being made and other TV series being made that had nothing to do with rebooting anything. Now, those alternatives just really aren't there as much, or they require a little extra digging. I mean, I could go, I have the Criterion channel, so I could just watch that the rest of my life. You know what I mean? But at the same time, that's really a blip compared to the amount of money and visibility that some of these like really huge movies get. I looked at the top selling, the highest grossing films of 2019, top 20, all but two were like sequels, reboots, whatever. Of those two, one of them was Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino, which is itself like blatantly nostalgic, but I haven't seen it, but I hear it's at least, a decent movie.
It's
but
very good.
Okay, well, good. Yeah, see, nostalgia doing something great. But and then the other film was Jordan Peele's Us, which is like from what I know, a pretty totally original film idea. But their other 18 movies were Lion King, Avengers 6 or whatever. I don't know, whatever. And those rake in more money than you can imagine,
Yeah.
But the fact that there's that many in the top 20 is an indication that this kind of runaway media consolidation, franchise building, universe building, and kind of nostalgic sort of inducement is getting out of hand.
150%. Something else that I noticed about that too. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it seems like people will buy into these things knowing it'll suck. It's just that, like, look, this is like history happening. Oh, a new Lion King. I have to experience that. We know it's gonna. I don't know if it actually sucked, but we know it's. Like, the idea isn't that it's actually going to be good. It's just that, oh, this is a big spectacle that is happening. I want to be here to witness it. There almost isn't like a value thing. It's almost, truly in this context, it's almost like blind consumption, right? Where I think we can overemphasize things like the sheeple who just buys everything and just mindlessly consumes. I think most of the time it's not necessarily like that, but in some contexts, perhaps it is. And that's something that I've noticed. Like, we are often, I think, sociologically eager to consume stuff that we know probably doesn't do anything different. And that's ironically the point. And of course, as we've said, there's like very huge artistic impacts with that.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I do think that people, they watched some of these films and series because they're media events and because they are, it's almost like to be able to participate in a discourse, which today is happening online, then you have to see them and have an opinion about it and what happened. And like I said, most of the time, the opinion isn't, I loved the film. It's, well, they did this thing wrong and they wrote way and I wish you hadn't done that and blah, blah, blah. And some of this is because it's almost an untenable position. These corporations, by making these films, they are doing a kind of fan service, but you can't totally service the fans. They're going to get upset about it. This is one of the reasons why when they do a Ghostbusters remake and it stars an all female cast, that you have all of these people coming out of the woodwork getting super mad about it on YouTube, and they feel like their nostalgia has been stepped on or their beloved movie has been sullied in some way, and that other people are championing it. And then it goes back and forth. So you can't completely satisfy all the fans, which means that even though the numbers are really high in terms of they gross, nobody really likes them.
Yeah. Like it's not like blatant sexism completely that kills people with the whole Ghostbuster thing. It's their rejection of like this treasured past, right? Of this, like, it's an attack on their nostalgia. Yeah. So with cultural theory and critical theory, I find more often than not, this seems to be sort of like the thing, and that's okay, right? You don't need like an answer for everything, right? At least I don't necessarily think so. But I am curious, like, I read the introduction. I didn't really want to read much more into that because I'm probably going to sit down and have to read this. But I was wondering, what are some things, like what may be happening now or in the future that can maybe turn a tide of like a sort of pathological, super commodified nostalgia? Like, is there anything currently that might indicate to you that, oh, a potential tide could change? We could get back to raw creativity, or like what do you think?
I think in terms of like starting very small, like on like a individual or community based level, or just like in terms of trying to change the discourse of a society, I think that we have to come to terms with the fact that all nostalgia isn't bad, that it isn't something that we could kind of just move away from or move past, or that we need to somehow engineer out of ourselves or like look down on or be condescending towards. Because there's a lot of instances throughout history where nostalgia is used in really, dare I even say, like progressive ways, and are used to sort of bridge communities. And I write in the book about how environmentalism has long been associated with nostalgia. This is coming from some work done by a scholar named Alistair Bonnet, who was really the first one to talk about this. And it's something we have to think about when we are faced with kind of a climate future that is looking scary every single year. And that nostalgia is actually one emotion that could be a good one to have in our toolkit as we try to face this, because there was a time when the climate didn't look like this, and there's a reason why the climate is acting like this, and it has a lot to do with the system that we're currently operating within, which is called capitalism. And so having a bit of nostalgia is actually really, really beneficial in order to understand how we survive the future. It's also something Naomi Klein wrote about in her book, This Changes Everything, which is about climate change and capitalism. She talks about, kind of yearning for the social movements of the past, not necessarily for the conditions that produce the social movement, but for I think she calls it their ability to like dream in public and work together and get stuff done. So I think that we need to not necessarily ask ourselves whether it's a good thing to have emotion in politics or emotion in society in general, like nostalgia, but instead to figure out which are the right emotions for us at the right time, be able to recognize, see it. Like we should be able to see somebody like, and I'm not even getting into the material aspects, so give me a second, but you ought to be able to see somebody like Donald Trump, hear what he's doing, and understand it. Or even Joe Biden. Joe Biden had a blatantly nostalgic appeal on the campaign trail. He harkened back to the days of the Obama presidency. His campaign slogan was "Build Back Better," which is kind of like a liberals' version of a nostalgic, presidential slogan.
Right.
And we ought to be able to know what that is and understand it. I think we start to get into some frightening territory when we consume it fully and almost become rigidly ideological about it. Say like, that's right, make America great again. So let's do what needs to be done. Okay, no, we ought to know, like, okay, this is an appeal to our emotions. In particular, it's nostalgia, and I got to know one way or the other what that really is. We know what it means. It was a sort of a heinous attempt at trying to like sow discord and xenophobia into the populace. But we ought to be able to know that, starting with going, this is a nostalgic appeal. Okay, from a material perspective, something a little bigger. We know that they make these appeals primarily because nostalgia tends to attract attention. Like I said, it's associated with giving up one's money. Corporations that produce these major films, like Star Wars or whatnot, they know that these things are going to circulate well through social networks, just like how anger circulates well through social networks. Nostalgia does as well. And really trying to, I think trying to regulate these major multinational media corporations from slowly in their kind of Darwinian quest, sort of buying each other up until there's only one left, like Amazon, that needs to be reined in pretty quickly, because that's sort of what they're on track to do. And the more they do that, the more you're going to have the, Raging Bull cinematic universe or something.
Right.
And so being able to hold these corporations and our political leaders accountable for how they manipulate emotions, not just nostalgia, but anger as well, and how they tend to capitalize on them in really weak moments. Like, I mean, you can't help that the fact, that during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people got really nostalgic, rightfully so. I mean, like really bad time. After 9/11, there's a huge outbreak of nostalgia. These things, this happens after major events. That happens after events in your individual life. When I got out of college, I was really nostalgic for college. I was like, dang, I miss those times. Now I got to enter the working world and all of this. So we can't deny that those are legitimate emotional reactions. What we can do is try to hold these major figures accountable and push back on them a little bit when they try to do such what seems to me such blatant emotional inducing, like Tucker Carlson every single night. I can't imagine like how his mental state must be, but every single night going on a screen and being angry victim every night. But the thing is, people love it and they enter into this feedback loop with him and it becomes a daily thing that they do. And we have to know better than that.
No, I actually really like that. I'm thinking while you're saying this, I'm gauging all of what you said of potentially what to do. And, as a philosophy sort of focused and theory focused channel, there's a lot of people that may not like that but it's okay. But because it's almost, you have a very political aim with this. In my mind, that's good though. And I come from a political science background, so that might be why. But like, I think what you're doing here is you're prescribing, like, you're getting to like deeper political pathology other than surface sort of things we're used to, right? Like, nostalgia isn't something that we talk about in a political context, but it very much is. And so I think something like talking about nostalgia and in a sort of political context can probably open up avenues on a political level. And that's almost the problem with politics today, is there is no opening of like politics isn't practiced as something that evolves. Politics is like, in many ways, like it's practiced in a sort of historical manner. Like, for example, one of the biggest, I think, critiques a lot of people have with on the left with like the traditional sort of ethos of maybe like unfettered Marxism is that sometimes it's not able to grasp a lot of the newer sociological happenings today. The answer is the same of what we saw in the 20th century in Lenin or stuff like that. But I like the approach that you're like you're putting a sort of artistic, almost deep cultural tonality in a political context, and I actually think that's a good thing, and I think that's something that would probably revitalize a lot of sort of political movements of the future. I think
it would certainly. I mean, I would hope, and thank you for that. But I would hope that it would, revitalize some. At least make the discussions a little more interesting. Like if you want, these, talking heads on television and social media will talk about a politician's logic, or they'll give a speech and they break it down or whatnot, and like, yeah, that's important, but we can't also forget talking about their emotional tenor and sometimes that's talked about, but then again, it's like it'll get stopped at, well, they were really angry, period. And yeah, that is true. I mean, I do think that a lot of mainstream electoral politics in the United States, at least, is kind of trapped in an angry feedback loop, and that's kind of. But you know what? I mean, like, that's one emotion, and there's a lot that you could tap into with people and make them feel things other than just these really, really like gross, heightened states of just like happiness, anger, sadness, nostalgia, period. But there's more. And I think you could, and I think they're emotional beings. Like we could pick up on more complex emotions. And again, that doesn't mean they'll be used in the right ways. They certainly might not be. But at least it'd be a step away from the kind of the same old cycle of nostalgia and angry rhetoric, which I think that a lot of people in the United States are really fed up with. And they either want a change or they want to kind of throw the grenade in the voting booth and watch it explode, which is what they did with Donald Trump.
Right. Exactly. It seems like at all points, it seems like no matter what it is, stagnation is something like even if that stagnation protects us from something worse, like regression, it doesn't matter. Like there's going to be an almost impulsive reaction to that. And of course I'm speaking ideologically, because of course I think we can make the argument metaphysically, like nothing stays the same, right? Like, of course, economics, we were seeing deterioration to the working class. Like, people have been making less and less money after the '08 crisis. Nothing really happened. So of course things were getting worse. But I think ideologically, though, in the atmosphere of ideas, it was just the same old, hearkening back to the sort of same neoliberal tropes like you saw under the Obama administration, and even sort of going back to the only response is this third way Democrat sort of approach, right? Where it's just the same neoliberalism. So, and of course, you see people who see this very real material regression and they see the exact same political sort of ideological tendencies. What the fuck do? They vote for someone like Donald Trump, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, and I will say this too, as a addition to, like, how to use emotions better and what do we do. I think it's important to know also that we're always kind of consuming a past that isn't completely our own and that is not a perfect representation of what really happened.
I love that.
We know this, right? I mean, and it may never fully satisfy us either. And we have to understand that there's going to be loss that occurs in terms of, like, memory retrieval, knowing what really happened as we go back to history and try to understand it or what have you. The question isn't whether that's like, whether we're ever going to be able to truly remember the past or truly get back there or whatever. The question should be, which pasts are we consuming and who benefits from the consumption? So is it a good thing just to be nostalgic for the good old days, or is that somehow being used in a way to advance certain interests that, look, at the end of the day, is only going to benefit, and when I'm thinking about Donald Trump as an example, only going to benefit him and his kind of rich friends, basically, and the other people who are sort of benefiting, winning out in this game of capitalism. And so I think that's super important to kind of, or like, is Star Wars really a movie series, or is it a corporation's product, kind of like Coca-Cola? It's kind of the second one, and like, it doesn't mean that it can't engender, pretty interesting storylines or what have you, but we ought to know that's what's going on. Who benefits from the consumption ultimately?
Yeah, 150%. And I think what you're also talking about is something that, in some ways, the left has almost, in my mind, failed a little bit. I think what you're describing is you're like understanding what's happening, not necessarily moralize those happenings per se. I'm kind of a firm believer myself, and not totally, like, we can moralize things, we can categorize, we can structure things, but moralization of capitalism, good and bad, can get us away from sort of the understanding of what's going on, right? And so I think what you're describing, right, is you're understanding the pathologies that exist within capitalism, but you're discreetly going deeper than the same talking points that we've seen before in the past. And not that those talking points are incorrect, because most of them are correct. Like, let's be fucking honest. Like, capitalism, especially today, is a system that is we're seeing the trajectory right now. Like, we're going to all die due to climate change. Like, it's quite literally destroying everything. But I think we have to almost go beyond that. I think something like you're talking about with nostalgia, I think it's a really interesting, cool tool that I think is in a toolbox that we ought to think about more. And I actually really like your approach with that.
I appreciate that, man. Yeah, I'm hoping that that in a time when there's a lot of nostalgia, we could maybe start to take it seriously, like understand that it's serious business.
150%. Well, man, we're kind of running out of time here. I think we're roughly around the hour mark or so. But dude, it was so awesome talking to you, man. I really appreciate you coming on. I was scrambling to get this podcast going, and since it was such a short thing, I came up with in my head. I was like, you know what? I'm now full time. I'm gonna tack something onto this, and I've been so busy with uni. I graduated, but I'm really happy I was able to snag you, and I appreciate you so much being so flexible. And just within a couple days of contacting you, you were able to come on. That was super cool. But dude,
absolutely,
honestly, man, anytime, you are always welcome on. Whether that be I stream on YouTube as well, or on here. It's a pleasure talking to you, man, and I look forward to reading it whenever it comes out. Is there any way I can kind of plug, like, when's the book come out and where to find you?
It's out October 12th of this year, and I'm on social media, and then you could pre-order the book from local bookshops and also horrific giant corporations as well, but it'll be available everywhere October 12th.
Awesome, man. All right, thank you so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
Totally, Ian. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Thanks.